What are the worst interview answers that have definitely prevented people from getting hired? A guy completely sabotaged his own job interview by being way too honest about his ethical dilemma. This happened years ago, but I still think about it from time to time because of how surreal it was. I was sitting in on interviews at a company I worked for. Nothing fancy. Entry to mid-level role. Pretty standard process. One of the questions we asked every candidate was the classic, "Tell us about a time you faced an ethical dilemma. What did you do, and what was the outcome?" Most people give the usual answers. Something about disagreeing with a coworker, standing up to a manager, choosing honesty over convenience. You know the drill. Then this guy answered. He starts confidently explaining that he used to work at a store with his best friend. According to him, his friend was cheating him in a side business they were running together and not splitting the profits evenly. Instead of confronting him or walking away, he decided to teach him a lesson. His solution? He stole merchandise from the store they worked at, placed it in his friend's car without him knowing, and then anonymously called the police to report the theft. His friend was arrested. He told this part very calmly, as if describing a clever workaround. Then, without missing a beat, he added that while his friend was in jail, he slept with his friend's girlfriend. He framed all of this as his response to being treated unfairly and presented it as an example of how he handled an ethical conflict. The room was completely silent. No self-reflection. No acknowledgement that maybe this was excessive. No lesson learned. Just a straightforward story involving theft, deception, betrayal, and what sounded like several crimes, all delivered during a job interview. At one point, one of the interviewers gently asked something like, "And, looking back, would you do anything differently?" He shrugged and said something along the lines of, "No, he shouldn't have crossed me." That was the moment we all realized this interview was already over. What stuck with me wasn't just how inappropriate the story was, it was how sincerely he believed this demonstrated strong ethics. In his mind, the problem wasn't his actions, but the fact that his friend had wronged him first. Everything else was justified retaliation. To be clear, no one scolded him or reacted dramatically. We thanked him for his time, wrapped things up professionally, and obviously did not move forward with his application. But once he left, everyone just sat there for a moment trying to process what we had just heard. It's one of those stories that becomes legendary in a workplace. Whenever someone mentions oversharing in interviews, this guy immediately comes up. The takeaway, I guess, is this. When employers ask about ethical dilemmas, they are not asking for the most extreme story you can think of. They are not inviting confessions. They are looking for judgment, accountability, and growth. Sometimes honesty is important. Other times, discretion is a skill. And sometimes the correct answer is absolutely not admitting to behavior that could double as a police report. A guy showed up to a design interview with my own work in his portfolio. This is one of those moments that lives rent-free in my head. I was interviewing candidates for a design role. Pretty standard process. Walk through your portfolio, talk about your role on projects, explain decisions, challenges, timelines, the usual. Then this guy opens his portfolio, and I recognize the work instantly. Because it's mine. Not inspired by, not similar. My actual project. Same layout, same interactions, same little design quirks that only exist because I agonized over them at 2 a.m. I didn't say anything right away. Instead, I let him talk. For several minutes. I asked when the project was done, which company it was for, what team he worked on, what his specific contributions were. He answered confidently. Very confidently. Then I said something along the lines of, "That's interesting. I also worked at that company, at that exact time, on that exact team." You could see the moment it hit him. I've never seen someone want to physically dissolve into their chair so badly. Absolute panic behind the eyes. I didn't raise my voice or accuse him outright. I just gave him one piece of advice. It's a very small industry. Interview ended shortly after. What really gets me is how common this apparently is. A friend of mine once worked at a stereo store years ago. The manager had a very high-end home sound system stolen from his house. 2 days later, a guy walks into the store wanting to sell a great system he just happens to have. Same system. Serial numbers and all. The police were called. Another story. A guy was almost hired as a youth pastor at my parents' church. He was asked to submit a theology paper. What he submitted was a paper written by the lead pastor. The same lead pastor who was reading the application. Immediate rejection. I've also heard multiple professors talk about students applying to art or photography programs using portfolio pieces created by, you guessed it, the professors themselves, or even the department head. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. One hiring manager I know was reviewing sample code from a software engineering candidate. The boss was impressed, until someone ran a quick comparison and found it matched publicly available example code almost line for line. Turns out one of the evangelists who wrote that sample code was someone the hiring manager personally knew and recognized by coding style alone. It's wild. What's even wilder is the mindset behind it. I constantly hear capable, honest people talk about feeling like imposters, even when they've genuinely earned their place. Meanwhile, there are people out there confidently presenting stolen work, assuming no one will notice. I can't imagine the mental gymnastics required to think that's a good idea. If there's any lesson here, it's this. People talk. Industries are smaller than they seem, and the risk of being exposed is never zero. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to oversell yourself. But pretending to be someone else, especially by stealing their work, is one of the fastest ways to guarantee you won't be taken seriously again. And if you're ever tempted to do it, just remember, there's a non-zero chance the person interviewing you is the one who actually made the thing you're claiming as your own. People who lie about speaking foreign languages in interviews are way more common than you'd think. I've learned that one of the fastest ways to expose exaggeration or outright dishonesty in a job interview is to gently poke at language skills. A candidate once kept going on and on about how many languages he spoke. It wasn't even relevant to the role. No international clients, no translation work, nothing. But he brought it up repeatedly, clearly proud of it. Eventually, I asked a simple follow-up. Which foreign language would you say you're most fluent in? He answered confidently, Spanish. So I smiled and asked him a very basic question in Spanish. Nothing fancy. The kind of thing you'd expect anyone with even conversational fluency to understand. Blank stare. No response. He did not speak Spanish. At all. There was a long, uncomfortable pause where we both knew what had just happened, but neither of us acknowledged it directly. The rest of the interview limped along, but the damage was done. Once credibility is gone, it doesn't really come back. Oddly enough, I've also experienced the exact opposite scenario. I once listed Dutch as a foreign language on my resume. It's my mother tongue. I grew up speaking it. The interviewer looked at it, scoffed, and said, "Do you really speak Dutch?" I said yes. He replied, "Say something in Dutch." So I asked him, "Do you speak Dutch?" He said no. I paused and said, "Then how will you know if I'm actually speaking Dutch?" Without missing a beat, he said, "Oh, I'll know." At that point, I said a perfectly normal sentence, in Danish. He nodded approvingly and said, "Ah, yes, that's Dutch." That was the moment I mentally checked out of the interview. I did not pursue the job further. If someone is that confident while being that wrong, I don't need to find out what that looks like in day-to-day management. This kind of thing isn't limited to job interviews either. A cousin of mine was visiting the US, from England, and stopped at a small-town diner. The waitress, trying to be friendly, asked if it was difficult for her to learn English before coming to America. My cousin was completely stunned. She didn't know how to respond at first, because the question revealed such a deep misunderstanding that correcting it felt like opening a much larger conversation than anyone had time for over coffee. I think what fascinates me about these stories isn't just the ignorance, it's the confidence. People will assert expertise they don't have, challenge knowledge they don't understand, and test others in areas where they themselves have zero ability to verify the answer. It's a strange mix of insecurity and certainty. There's a lesson here somewhere. If you don't know something, it's okay to say you don't know. If you don't speak a language, don't claim that you do. And if you're going to test someone's skills, maybe make sure you're actually capable of recognizing the result. Otherwise, you're not evaluating anyone, you're just revealing yourself. The strangest interview I ever witnessed, when the boyfriend and mom answered everything I once sat in on an interview that still lives rent-free in my head. A candidate showed up, with her boyfriend. At first, no one said anything. Maybe he was just giving her a ride. Maybe moral support. People do that sometimes, especially when they're nervous. Fair enough. But then the interview started, and the boyfriend started answering the questions. Not once, not occasionally, consistently. She'd be asked about her experience, and he'd jump in. She'd be asked about her skills, and he'd explain them. At one point, she took a sip of water, and he answered while she was still drinking. It was honestly impressive in a surreal way, like some kind of human ventriloquist act. The candidate herself mostly nodded along. That interview ended quickly. After that experience, I started paying more attention to similar stories, and it turns out this isn't as rare as you'd hope. I have 2 close friends who work in HR. Both of them have independently told me about candidates showing up to interviews with their mothers. At first, they'd think, okay, maybe they just needed a ride. Not everyone drives. So they wouldn't judge right away. But then they'd walk out to greet the candidate and say, "Hi, we'll head into the interview room now." And the mom would stand up too. When politely told that she could wait in the lobby, some mothers insisted on coming along. In other cases, the candidate themselves asked, or outright demanded, that their mom be part of the interview. One case still amazes me. The mother answered nearly every question while the candidate sat there scrolling on their phone. No exaggeration. You want to believe that the parent was just desperate for their child to get a job, that they meant well, that it came from concern, not control. But more often than not, it's the result of something much sadder. There are parents who, for years, do absolutely everything for their children. They don't teach independence. They don't allow failure. They don't step back. And the result is adults who have never learned how to function on their own. I know people who lived at home until their 30s and had never done laundry, never cooked a meal, never washed a dish, never even made a cup of coffee by themselves. One friend of mine watched her daughter, who grew up like that, marry a man who was raised the same way. They eat out constantly. 10 years into the marriage, my friend still batch cooks meals for them, so they have something edible in the house. She still does their grocery shopping, not because of hardship, not because of illness, because neither of them ever learned how. When people talk about failure to launch, this is what they mean. Not laziness, not lack of intelligence, but learned helplessness, reinforced over decades. Interviews where someone else speaks for you, whether it's a partner or a parent, aren't just awkward. They're a warning sign. They say, this person has never been allowed to stand on their own. And that's not something you can fix in a job interview. It's just sad to watch. Worst interview moment I've ever witnessed. And it somehow kept getting worse. I once sat on an interview panel for a public sector role in the UK. Healthcare adjacent, fairly senior, with a strong emphasis on procurement, contract management, and, crucially, data security and confidentiality. Candidates were given very clear instructions ahead of time. They knew there would be a presentation. They knew the assessment criteria. Nothing about this was a surprise. Enter this candidate. He starts his presentation setup and immediately says his laptop battery is dead. Fair enough, things happen. He asks if he can plug it in. One of the panel members, An older woman, senior in her field, gets down on her knees under the boardroom table to reach the socket. And that's when he says, with a grin, "Well, look at that. I've only been here 5 minutes and I've already got a woman on her knees." The room went absolutely silent. There are awkward jokes, there are poorly judged attempts at humor, and then there are moments where you can physically feel every professional bridge being set on fire at once. This was the latter. And somehow, it didn't stop there. Once his laptop powered up, we had to wait several minutes while he closed applications. Discord, Steam, multiple gaming launchers. They just kept reopening themselves. No apology, no acknowledgement, just clicking through them like this was a totally normal thing to happen in a formal interview. Then, as he starts the presentation, loud startup music from a first-person shooter game suddenly blasts through his speakers. He scrambles to mute it, shrugs, and continues. Again, this was a role involving sensitive data, contracts, and strict information governance. His desktop was fully visible the entire time. It was absolutely covered in invoices, quotes, and documents displaying company names, individual names, and clearly identifiable information. Exactly the sort of thing you're explicitly told not to expose in this kind of setting. He finished the presentation. No one on the panel asked a single question. We thanked him politely and told him that was everything. As he reached the door, he turned back and said, genuinely curious, "So, I think I messed that up, didn't I?" "No, mate. You absolutely nailed it." So I've sat through plenty of mediocre interviews. I've seen people underprepare, get nervous, or misunderstand the brief. That's all human. This, however, was something else entirely. Between the inappropriate comment, the complete lack of professionalism, the disregard for confidentiality, and the total absence of self-awareness, it was honestly impressive how badly it went. Whoever ends up hiring him is taking on more than an employee. They're taking on a future incident report, and possibly a lawsuit waiting to happen. Still one of the most astonishing interview experiences I've ever witnessed. Candidate was rude to my assistant, so I ended the interview on the spot. I once had an interview that ended far faster than planned. Not because of a lack of qualifications, but because of a complete lack of basic decency. The candidate was technically fine on paper. Solid resume, relevant experience, nothing obviously alarming. But within minutes of arriving, he managed to disqualify himself entirely. He was openly rude to my assistant. Not subtly, not in a "maybe I'm reading too much into this" way. He did it right in front of me. She politely asked if he'd like a glass of water or coffee while we finished setting up. Instead of answering like a normal human being, he put his finger to his lips and said, "Shh," at her. I was genuinely stunned. I stopped the interview immediately and asked him to leave. What's shocking to me isn't just that it happened, but how often this kind of thing happens. People treat receptionists, assistants, and administrative staff as if they're invisible. Or worse, as if they're service workers they're allowed to demean. What some candidates fail to realize is that these people absolutely talk to the hiring managers afterward. In many workplaces, reception staff are very much part of the interview process, whether formally stated or not. Any half-decent interview guide spells this out clearly. Be polite to everyone, especially the people you might mistakenly think are beneath you. And honestly, it shouldn't even be strategic. It should just be how you treat people. When I interview candidates and write my evaluations afterward, I always start with demeanor. Were they polite? Did they listen? Did they interrupt? Did they ask thoughtful questions? Did they communicate clearly and respectfully? Only after that do I get into technical skills. Why? Because technical gaps can often be trained. Character flaws usually can't. For senior roles especially, I care far more about whether someone can communicate well, learn quickly, turn research into action, plan effectively, and, most importantly, be someone others actually want to work with. A workplace runs on trust and respect. Without those, all the technical expertise in the world won't save you. I've heard countless similar stories. A receptionist who always flagged rude candidates, leading to instant rejections. A legal secretary with effective veto power over clerk hires, earned through decades of experience. A judge who ignored that advice once, regretted it deeply, and never made that mistake again. I've even heard the inverse, candidates walking away from jobs because the interviewer was rude to support staff. One person told me they declined an interview on the spot after the hiring manager insulted their own secretary. Frankly, I respect that. Some people act like common courtesy is optional. In any professional environment, it isn't. It's foundational. And if saying no thank you politely is too much effort, then you probably aren't someone I want representing my team, my company, or my values. Treating people well isn't a bonus. It's the baseline. Candidate shared classified patient data during an interview. Immediate disqualification. I once had an interview that went off the rails in a way I honestly didn't expect. And I work in healthcare analytics, so my bar for things that should never happen is already pretty high. The candidate was interviewing remotely from another region. On paper, she looked qualified. Relevant background, experience in a similar domain, and nothing that raised red flags ahead of time. The interview was progressing normally until, midway through, she decided to demonstrate the kind of work she was currently doing. Important context. We did not ask for a live demo. She did not ask for permission to share her screen. She simply started screen sharing. What appeared on her screen immediately made our stomachs drop. There were clear patient identifiers visible, full names, health card numbers, and other sensitive medical information. No redaction, no anonymization, no hesitation. We shut it down immediately. In healthcare, patient privacy and data security are not abstract ideas or best practice suggestions. They are foundational, non-negotiable obligations. Violating them isn't just a mistake. It can result in serious harm to patients, massive legal exposure, and irreversible loss of trust. The most alarming part wasn't just that the data was visible. It was how casually it was treated. There was no apparent awareness that what she was doing was deeply inappropriate. No pause, no "I've anonymized this" explanation, just a full, unfiltered view into real patient records. At that moment, the interview was effectively over. If someone is willing to expose confidential information from their current employer during a job interview without being asked, there is absolutely no reason to believe they would treat our data any differently. Trust, once broken at that level, cannot be rebuilt. Because of the severity of the breach, this didn't end with simply rejecting the candidate. We were required to file a report with her institution. That wasn't punitive, it was necessary. Healthcare organizations have legal and ethical responsibilities to investigate potential privacy violations, especially when protected health information is involved. I don't say that lightly. Nobody enjoys escalating something like that, but ignoring it would have been irresponsible. This experience reinforced something I now emphasize whenever I interview or mentor others. Being technically skilled means nothing if you don't understand professional boundaries. In fields like healthcare, finance, or security, discretion is not optional. You don't demonstrate competence by oversharing. You demonstrate it by knowing what not to show, what not to say, and when to stop. If you're ever tempted to prove how capable you are by revealing sensitive material, don't. The fastest way to fail an interview is to show that you can't be trusted with the very thing the job exists to protect. Confidentiality isn't just part of the job. It is the job. If you're rude to staff, don't be surprised when you don't get the job. I used to work at a big box retail store, and one day I got called up to the service counter to help de-escalate an upset customer. This happened maybe 5 minutes before I was scheduled to conduct an interview with a potential new hire. I walk up, and this woman is absolutely tearing into the employee behind the counter, loud voice, insults, referring to her as that woman, and worse, treating her like she was somehow less than human for a minor issue. I stepped in, and asked her to lower her voice and stop being disrespectful to my employee. She clearly didn't like being corrected, but eventually calmed down enough for us to resolve the issue. Problem solved. Or so I thought. I turned to leave, already mentally shifting gears to the interview I had coming up, when she casually said, "Anyway, I'm here for my interview." I genuinely thought she was joking. It felt like something out of a badly written rom-com, where fate lines everything up for a lesson to be learned. She was not joking. She fully expected me to walk her into a room and interview her for a customer-facing role after she had just publicly berated one of my employees. I looked at her and said, very calmly, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but that position is no longer available." And that was that. That moment reminded me of another experience from earlier in my retail days, when I was about 19. I once spent a long time helping a customer who wasn't outright rude, but was extremely demanding. Lots of questions, lots of second-guessing, lots of taking up time. I stayed professional throughout. Toward the end, she questioned whether I was telling the truth about a product limitation. I reassured her that I was giving her accurate information. She rolled her eyes and made a dismissive, insulting gesture. I calmly told her I had provided all the information available and left her to make her decision. Later, I shared the story with my coworkers as a classic difficult customer moment. Months passed. One day, I saw her back in the store. I nudged my manager and said, "That's the woman I told you about." His eyes went wide. "I just hired her." He wasn't joking. We became coworkers. And unfortunately, her behavior quickly made it clear that the earlier incident was not a one-off bad day. It was a pattern. These experiences cemented something I firmly believe now. How you treat service staff tells people everything they need to know about how you'll behave as an employee. Some people seem to think that politeness is optional, or that employees behind counters are somehow invisible. What they don't realize is that in many workplaces, especially good ones, everyone notices. Receptionists notice, clerks notice, managers notice. Being rude isn't confidence, it's not strength, and it's definitely not something that gets forgotten when hiring decisions are made. If you can't show basic respect to someone who's just doing their job, don't be surprised when doors quietly close behind you. Interview horror stories. When candidates tell on themselves in the first 5 minutes. Back when I worked in corporate, we were interviewing for a middle management role. Nothing entry-level, nothing junior, a position that required leadership, judgment, and at least a baseline understanding of professional behavior. The candidate walks into the conference room, before a handshake, before introductions, before anyone even sits down. He looks at me and asks, completely straight-faced, if I was there to take notes for the boys' meeting. Not a joke, not awkward humor, just said it like it was the most normal thing in the world. I paused for a second, mostly to confirm that yes, this was actually happening. "I am not," I said. "Next." The interview technically continued, but let's just say it never recovered from that opening line. A colleague later joked that the better move would have been to let the interview run and watch him squirm. Something along the lines of, "I'd like to start this interview by having you explain why you thought that comment was appropriate, and what part of it you found funny in any way." Honestly, that might have been entertaining, but sometimes the fastest path is also the clearest one. Unfortunately, this wasn't a one-off experience. I've heard variations of this story more than once, and sometimes the candidates disqualify themselves even more thoroughly when you give them room to talk. One time, I was interviewing a candidate for a role that would report directly to me. Standard question. Can you describe your most challenging work experience and how you handled it? His answer? He launched into a story about how he disliked taking direction from his previous boss. Why? Because she was a woman. According to him, she didn't really understand the work, and he knew better. So how did he handle this challenge? By regularly going over her head to her boss. He told this story as if it demonstrated leadership, initiative, and confidence. What it actually demonstrated was a complete lack of respect for authority, an inability to work with women in leadership, and astonishingly poor self-awareness, all in one tidy anecdote. The wild part is that none of these people seem to realize they're waving massive red flags. Interviews aren't just about technical skill. They're about judgment, self-control, awareness of context, understanding how power, respect, and communication work in real organizations. You can teach systems. You can teach processes. You cannot teach someone not to undermine their manager because of their gender. You cannot teach basic respect in a one-hour interview. And the moment someone shows you who they are, especially when they think they're impressing you, it's best to believe them. Some candidates don't fail interviews because they lack experience. They fail because they open their mouths before thinking and tell you exactly why hiring them would be a mistake. Interviewing someone who literally ran every answer through AI. I recently had a candidate show up to a Zoom interview, and it quickly became obvious that they were not actually thinking on their own. At first, everything seemed normal. They'd waffle a little on the questions, hesitate, maybe try to buy time. Then suddenly, almost unnaturally, they'd give an answer that was precise, polished, textbook perfect. The kind of answer that reads like it came straight from a study guide or an article, not a live conversation. It wasn't just the perfection of the answers. It was the rhythm and cadence. The way they paused for a beat, then recited the response almost verbatim. At some point, I noticed their eyes flicking toward a second screen. That's when it hit me. They were literally running every single question through AI and reading the output back to me in real time. I've seen similar behavior from candidates before, stalling with repetition, rephrasing my question just long enough to compute the answer, and then delivering something that sounds professional but has zero authenticity. It's a strange combination of confident and robotic at the same time, and it's unsettling. I cut the interview short, reported it to their recruiting agency, and made a note in the file. Because here's the thing. Technical knowledge can be taught. Interviewing etiquette, soft skills, and authentic problem-solving can be assessed in real time. But if someone is relying entirely on AI to answer questions, you're not really assessing them at all. You're assessing how well they can read AI-generated text aloud. It's wild to me how this has started happening more often. On one hand, AI is an amazing tool. I use it myself to brainstorm, summarize, or check ideas. On the other hand, using it as a crutch during an interview crosses a line. It's not just dishonest, it's actively misleading. And the weird part is, I can usually tell pretty quickly. The pacing, the phrasing, the sudden swings from vague to perfectly articulated. It sticks out like a sore thumb. Once you notice it, it's hard to unsee. Honestly, it makes me wonder, how many people out there are doing this? And how many companies are actually catching it? I've got no problem with AI for research or prep, but when it's being used as a substitute for thinking in the moment, that's when it becomes a problem. Has anyone else seen this happen in interviews recently? It's surreal to watch someone perform like that, and honestly kind of sad. You want to hire a real human being, someone who can engage, think critically, and solve problems, not someone who's just a mouthpiece for an AI.